That's okay.
There we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Dravet Syndrome Foundation for our first educational webinar of 2023. Tonight's topic is clinical trial experience and the importance of patient participation. I'm Marianne Meskis, the DSF Executive Director. And first off, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their support of this educational webinar series. Thanks to BioCodex, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, Takeda, and UCB. Just to let everyone know, the session will be recorded and available on demand. We ask all of our participants to remain on mute during the presentations. We will have the opportunity for questions, so please feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat box. And then with that, we'll go ahead and start the webinar with DSF Scientific Director, Dr. Veronica Hood, who's going to give us an overview of clinical trial participation.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight talking about clinical trials. And so I'm just going to give you an overview of what clinical trials are, why it's so important that we have patient participation from the community, where you can go to find information about clinical trials, and then going over just some of the complicated terms that you might encounter when you're looking through clinical trial information. And then we'll end on just some things you should consider before we go over to the panel who's going to talk to you firsthand about their experiences. And so just starting off very basic, clinical trials or clinical studies are just any sort of research that involves human volunteers. And their goal is to increase our medical understanding. Clinical studies really fall into two major bins. The first of which are going to be interventional trials. These are probably what you think of when you hear clinical trial. So this is trying to assess if some sort of drug or other type of therapeutic intervention improves some sort of symptom of a disease or disorder. And they're going to focus on if it's safe and effective and if there are side effects or other risks and benefits from that intervention. There are also non-interventional trials. So this is not going to do any sort of medication, no intervention, just as the name insinuates. And these are going to be things like you may have heard the term natural history studies or observational studies. And these are just going to help us understand more about the progression of a disease or a symptom in a particular patient population. And these can be incredibly important studies, and they can actually inform interventional trials in the future. So the community is really what drives research, and I just wanted to use a few examples of things that have happened specifically in Dravet syndrome and how the community has been integral in those advancements. And so you're probably aware that Dravet syndrome was first described in the late 1970s, but we didn't understand the cause until almost a little over 20 years later, that these were linked to mutations in the SCN1A gene. And I think families at that time were like, we finally understand this. Now there will be progress with research. And almost 10 years later, in 2009, families were frustrated because there hadn't been much research and there were no therapies in the developmental pipeline. And so those families came together and they founded the Dravet Syndrome Foundation with the goal to fund research. And now you look another 20 years later, and there are now 3 drugs that have been FDA approved for Dravet syndrome. And there's this really robust pipeline of other drugs that are either in clinical trials or in preclinical development. And so some of the ways that all of that has happened has been one through strategically funding research. So DSF now has directed $6.7 million to research. And they've, been really selective in what they've funded. So they funded basic research. They've also funded clinical studies, small interventional trials and observational trials to better understand the disease. DSF has helped fund studies that have helped better estimate the incidence of the disease, so how common Dravet syndrome is, And that can be really important for developing therapies because companies need to know that they can recoup the very, very large costs that go into clinical studies. And so having a larger patient population can actually make it more attractive to develop therapies. DSF has also helped to develop medical codes that can be used to accurately describe Dravet syndrome and help patients then access treatments that are FDA approved. And DSF is also engaged with government regulators and help them understand the patient voice and make sure that the patient voice is present in their decision making. So an example of that was last year when we held the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. But I think one of the things that's a little less tangible, because you can't put a dollar amount on it or you can't cite a fact, but it's the way that DSF has brought the community together and made sure that people have a single place where they can find out information about the research and trials that are ongoing, make sure that you know where then to go if you want to participate in those trials, and has just been this common hub to bring the community together. And really without that, you could never have gone from those basic research studies to get to clinical trials. If the community was not there, if the community was not in a place where they could be found to participate in the trials, and if they weren't educated about trial participation. And so, from all of those things, from all of the foundation and the community coming together to make those things happen, we've seen other trickle-down effects from that. So big funding from the NIH to fund research has increased exponentially. There's more publications and there's a better understanding of Dravet syndrome and the diagnosis and the ways to treat it. Like I already mentioned, there's all these FDA-approved medications, but there's also many therapies that are still in preclinical development and in the clinical trial pipeline. So it's been pretty impressive what a small group of frustrated parents could do when they came together and founded this, and what the community continues to be able to do to try to reach these better outcomes. And the participation of the community is absolutely crucial to that, like I just said. And participating in research studies and in clinical trials is a way to make the community's voice heard. It's a way that you can take action. So much is out of your control when you're faced with a rare disease. This is one way that you can take a small piece back into your control and make that choice. And even if enrolling in a trial isn't successful for your loved one, every participant in the trial is making a difference for the care of the whole community. And so I think it's something that you can really be proud of if you participate in research, that you've really helped contribute to the community as a whole. All right, so I've told you about how important research is. How do you find research opportunities relevant to Dravet syndrome? And so I just wanted to tell you that DSF curates a web page specifically with actively enrolling clinical trials. So you can go to dravetclinicaltrials.org, or if you're already on the dravetfoundation.org website, under the menu, you can go to research and then current research studies and pipelines. And so here's just an example of what that page looks like on the DSF website. So we'll have a listing of all the actively enrolling clinical trials, and then each of these you can drop down the arrow and you'll just get some basic information about the trial, and then many more links to more information. So if the company or the sponsor of the trial has a website, if they've developed brochures, we'll link those there. We'll also have a link to the clinicaltrials.gov listing, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. And then we may also have just like the direct contact information if you want to know more about that particular trial. And so this is where I would recommend you go to first find information, because it's streamlined and it's sort of all of the active trials that are going on for Dravet syndrome. But you can also go to clinicaltrials.gov. And I actually wanted to walk through this website a little bit today in the presentation, because it's kind of a complicated website. There's just a ton of information on it. And I think it's a great way to go through all of the trial terms that you might encounter while also learning how to navigate this website. And so I'm just working with the traditional clinicaltrials.gov page. They are trying to build a better, more user-friendly looking page. And if you want to use that when you're at the clinicaltrials.gov site, you can go up to the top and click and find out about the site that they're building, and you can even give them feedback on how to make it better. But if you just go to the main page, you can search by Dravet syndrome, or you could also, if there's a particular drug or company, you want to find that specific trial, you can search by that too. And you'll end up with a list of all the different trials that are either ongoing or have completed for Dravet syndrome. And so I'm going to start using some examples of what it looks like if you click on one of those trials that's active. Since this webinar is not to tell you about one specific trial, I've mixed and matched from some of the different active trials that are going on right now. So the drug name or the details might change from page to page, but this outline is the same for each trial. And so this will walk you through it. So this is just the main page that you end up on when you look at a trial. And this is going to tell you the trial name. So it should have the basic information of like what this trial is looking at. And a lot of companies will have a little more stylized name. So for example, this is the long name, but then this company is calling this the Argus trial. And so that's why that's there. You'll be able to see if this is an active trial, if it's actively recruiting right then, or if it's already been completed in this little box at the top. And then you'll also be able to see who the sponsor is. So the sponsor is the company, or sometimes it's an institute that is overseeing the study. They're covering the costs for the study, and they're who's going to collect the data from the study. The only other thing I just wanted to mention is that every trial that's registered on clinicaltrials.gov gets this National Clinical Trial Number, an NCT number. This is just a unique identifier. I just wanted to mention it because you see it a lot. And it's another way, if you have that number, that you can search for the specific trial on this site. So after you go past that first little bit of information, the first sections you're going to come to are the study description and the study design. And this is just going to tell you the basics about that trial. I wanted to zoom in on the official title of this trial and use that as an example to go over some of the terms, because if you read this, it's quite the mouthful. A multi-center, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, parallel group study with open label extension phase of the study drug as adjunctive treatment in subjects with Dravet syndrome. And so if you haven't been in the world of clinical trials, there might be some terms in here that you're not familiar with. Even if you are, it's almost a tongue twister just to read through that whole thing. So let's break it down a little bit. The first thing I wanted to talk about is placebo-controlled. So a placebo just means that half of the patients are going to receive, it might be called a sham treatment. You might just have heard it referred to as a sugar pill, but it's going to be something to take the place of a study drug. And there'll be a subset of patients in a placebo-controlled trial that receive this placebo or sham treatment, so that they can be a comparison to the participants that are actually receiving the study drug. The next thing I want to talk about are blinded studies. And so this one, for example, is a double blind, which means that neither the participants or the study leads, like the PIs at the site, will know who's in the placebo group and who's in the control. And this just helps to prevent bias. And so, most of the time, bias isn't as nefarious as someone wants this trial to be successful, so they make a lot of money off the drug. It can be as simple as a clinician really wants this drug to work because they would love their patients to do better. And that can actually impact even the way they record data. And so blinding studies is a way just to avoid that there's any unintentional bias in reporting the data. The next thing is randomized. And so this just means that when you're breaking out the placebo and treatment groups, that no one's sitting down with a spreadsheet and deciding who goes into which group based on the severity of their disease or other characteristics in their medical history, that it's just completely random, that they get randomly assigned a number of whether they'll have the placebo or the treatment. Multi-center just means there's several clinical sites that'll be involved in the study. So it's not just taking place at one institute. And so you may have opportunities in several geographical locations that you can participate in the trial. And then the other term I wanted to mention from this title was open label extension. This is another phase of a trial where patients, once they've completed that placebo control portion, can then remain on the study drug. So open label, everyone knows it's no longer blinded. Everyone knows what they're on, that it's the study drug. And they can continue to receive that study drug while they're in the open label extension. And that can really help bridge the gap between the time you complete a study and before a study gets approved by the FDA. And it also allows the researchers to keep monitoring you to make sure that the treatment is safe and effective over a longer period of time. Okay, so going back to the clinicaltrials.gov website, the other couple of things that you'll see in this study description and design section, besides just that really complicated long title, is going to be who or what is being targeted. So the condition or disease, in this case, it was, just listed as generalized epilepsies or myoclonic epilepsy. But, often you might see actually spelled out Dravet syndrome there or other epilepsy syndromes. It'll tell you, is there going to be a placebo and a study drug? Down here, it's telling you whether it's interventional or observational. And then the other thing that you'll see in this box over here is the phase of the trial that you're in. And so I talked about open label extension phases, but the other phases of the trial that you'll often hear about are phase 1, 2, and 3, and sometimes 4. Phase 1 is usually healthy volunteers. This is sort of the first signal group to make sure that a drug is safe in humans and to determine what a safe dose range might be and to understand how the body processes those doses. If that's successful and safe, it moves on to phase 2. And here's where you're actually putting it into the intended patient population and using a slightly larger group. And the purpose here is still really focused on safety, but you're also wanting to see, is this effective at all in treating any of the symptoms? Are there any side effects or other risks that are emerging with this? If that's successful, it'll move to phase 3. So here's where you need a significantly larger group of patients, and you're really trying to show in phase 3 that this is effective at treating the symptoms that you were hoping to target. And you're still watching to make sure it's safe and that there's no adverse reactions. If that goes well, hopefully you receive FDA approval after phase 3. And then sometimes phase 4 continues on after that approval, and that's just where the sponsor continues to understand longer term effectiveness of the drug and continues to monitor if there are long-term safety concerns. Something else that you might see, and it happens more commonly in rare diseases where the patient populations are small, is that sometimes the phases of trials might be combined. And so you might see something like a phase 1/2 study where it's still a small group, but you're never putting it into healthy volunteers. You're going straight into the group of patients. This is something that gets seen a lot with genetic therapies, because you wouldn't want to put a genetic-based therapy into a healthy person. And so you might really start with a small group of patients and really look at that safety first and foremost, while you're also assessing if it's effective or not. Okay. And so then I'm going back to the clinicaltrials.gov page, and you start to move down, and the next section you'll come across is trial arms and interventions. And so this is just breaking down the treatment groups. So here is an example from the Stoke trial that's going on right now, where it's not placebo controlled, but they have two different arms where it's either you get a single dose of the medication or multiple doses of the medication. And then over to the right, it's telling you, what that means. So you get the one dose and they're trying it at different dose levels. In other studies where you have placebo control, that would be the two arms. So this example down here, you have either the experimental EPX 100 or you have a placebo arm, and it's telling you the details of what that looks like. The next section, after you're looking at the trial arms, we'll be looking at something called outcome measures. And this is just what the trial is trying to measure, just as it sounds. And so you might also hear these called endpoints. In Dravet syndrome, most often, the first outcome that they're looking at is seizures. That's because it's the most prominent symptom, but it's also one of the easier ones to quantify. And so it's the easiest way for them to say, yes, this is having a positive impact, or no, it isn't. So that's one of the most common primary outcomes you'll see in Dravet syndrome, but you'll also see a lot of focus on secondary outcome measures. And so these are other symptoms and characteristics that the researchers also want to look at, and that they still think would be really important if the treatment showed a difference, but it just may not be as likely from their preliminary evidence to impact those symptoms. And it isn't what they're initially going to measure, but they're hoping, they might also see changes there. All right, so once you get past the outcome measures, the next thing that you will see, oh, sorry, I think my slides got moved out of order. So what you should actually see next is eligibility criteria. And so after the outcome measures, you'll scroll down and you'll see criteria, both inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so these are going to be things, one, like having a confirmed diagnosis of Dravet syndrome is often in this list. It's going to tell you the age range that they're targeting in the study, whether they're targeting a specific sex, whether they'll allow healthy volunteers or just a specific diagnosis. And then there might be other things, like since a lot of the primary outcome measures are to measure seizure counts, within the inclusion criteria, it may be that you need to have a set number of seizures within a certain amount of time before starting the trial drug, to show that there is a measurable seizure burden for them to measure a change after receiving the trial drug. And then there'll also be exclusion criteria, so reasons that they may not want you in the trial, whether it's a medication that you're on or some other underlying medical condition that's contraindicated. And then just to mention that these can differ from trial to trial, depending, even if it's a traditional medication and they're targeting the same population of patients with Dravet syndrome, there can be slight differences, but depending on the study drug. Okay. And then the last thing that you'll find on the clinicaltrials.gov site are the contacts and locations. And this one can be kind of tricky. So you're trying to figure out, is there a site near me? And so it's never expanded. And so you'll come to this section, and I can't tell you how many times I've just easily scrolled past the locations. So you actually have to go to the little arrow and expand this section, and then it'll be organized by state and by country of where the different trial sites are. Depending on the trial, it might have site-specific contact information, but there should also be like a general contact information there. And so just as a recap, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov to find all this information. You can go to dravetclinicaltrials.org, where we kind of curate this information a little bit more for you. I think that's the best place to start. Certainly, if there are sites that we've linked that the sponsor has developed a site specific to the trial with information or a brochure, that's going to be the easiest way just to get the basic information about the trial. And I would suggest coming to clinicaltrials.gov once you want to know even more of those details. I just feel like this site has a lot of information that can be helpful, but it can also be overwhelming if you're just trying to get those basics. And so if you're interested in a study, so then what should you do next? Definitely have conversations with your primary care and primary neurologist and make sure this is consistent, with the plan that you have with the whole healthcare team. You can contact the study organizers to ask more questions. And certainly just asking questions is so important. Before you actually begin a trial and start getting a treatment, you will go through a whole informed consent process where you'll have a document that you have to sign that's saying, you're agreeing to participate in the trial and you understand all the details and the risks. That consent document will have all of those details in it, but this is another really important opportunity to sit with that study team and ask any remaining questions that you might have. And so what are some of the questions that you might want to consider? I think we've talked, a little bit about some of these already just in going through trials. And I won't read every one of these off, but this is your chance to ask, what all is involved with the trial? How often are you going to need to go in person? How many of those visits can be televisits? Do you need to keep diaries? Will there be phone calls that you need to do? Or is there an app where you're going to have to fill things out? Are there other tests or procedures that your loved one is going to need to complete during the trial? How long will you be in the study? Is it going to impact other aspects of your care? Like, will you not be able to change other medication levels or add another new medication while you're in the trial? And who should be managing your overall medical care while you're in the trial? So some of those things also, like costs involved in participation. Most companies will help cover travel costs, but that's another thing that you should ask up front and be clear on. And I will share these slides after today's webinar. So if you want to look at these questions or any of these breakdowns in more details, I'll link that with the video. And so that's sort of my really quick clinical trial 101, but I just wanted to bring it all back to where I started, which was just the importance of the community in this. And DSF has a new tagline, community research progress, and notably community is at the front of that tagline. It is absolutely important that the whole community is involved to propel that research into progress. It's particularly challenging, like I said, in a rare disease for clinical trials and any type of research to happen involving human patients. And so if it makes sense for you and your child or loved one, it really makes a huge difference for the whole community if you participate. The only reason that there are FDA approved medications, that there are expert treatment guidelines, that there's an understanding of how this disease progresses in human patients. And the only reason that there are so many other therapies in development right now is because of all the time that families have invested so far in supporting research and in participating in these trials. And so it's something where huge thank you to all of the families that have done that, and a huge thank you to everyone who's considering doing it in the future. And if we all want to get to see to those, or if we all want to see those better cures happen, we have to keep encouraging and coming together as a whole community and helping make this happen by participating. And so with that, I just wanted to take one more second to thank the sponsors who are allowing these webinars to happen. So Biocodex, Jazz, Takeda, and UCB, thank you so much for sponsoring today's webinar. And with that, I can take any questions if anyone has them now, but otherwise we will switch over to our lovely panel who's going to be able to tell you from their lived experience what clinical trial participation is like.
That was really great, Veronica. Thank you. And I wanted to thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. There were a few questions that came through ahead of time that were not specific to clinical trial participation. So I just want to let you know we'll follow up on those separately offline. But Veronica, I do have a few questions for you. One of them was from a parent who wanted to know at what age can my child participate in trials?
Yeah. It varies wildly depending on what's available at the time. But there are actually trials that are, going down very commonly to the age of 2, and there are upcoming trials that may even go as young as 6 months. And so it's never too early to start learning about opportunities and considering participating in them.
And then the next one is, are there currently any trials for adults with Dravet syndrome, or can we expect any anytime soon?
So there are right off the top of my head there's it's a basket trial, which means they're involving more than just Dravet syndrome. They're basketing together a few developmental and epileptic encephalopathies. So some of the more severe childhood onset epilepsies. And that's the Longboard Pacific trial. And they're going from ages 12 to 65, I believe. And so that's a medication that's a little bit similar to the way that fenfluramine works in that it targets the serotonin pathway, but it acts just a little bit differently on that pathway, and they're hoping this might be another good option for the community. I'll have to go back and I can follow up after, and if you want to email me, veronica@dravetfoundation.org, I can check and let you know sort of what the age cutoffs are on some of the other trials. I know certainly several of them go up to 18 or 21. So it really depends on what age your adult is on whether that would work for you.
The next one was, how are adverse events documented as relevant or irrelevant?
Yeah, that's when, I don't know as much of the nitty gritty of what goes into that. We might be able to ask our clinical research coordinator who's on the call to give her input on that later. I know that every adverse event that happens gets reported, and they do try to tease apart what's related to the treatment versus what was maybe not related to the treatment, but just happened to happen while they were in the trial already. But because I have not run a clinical trial, I don't know all the behind the scenes of how they decide that and what level is involved.
And then we had 2 that came in through chat. The first one is, when you go to the open label extension, do you then get told whether or not you were on the actual drug or the placebo? If you are on the placebo, are you able to take that time are you able at that time to take the actual drug in the extension? And then how long does it usually take to get from double blind to open label?
Yeah. So clinical trials can take up to like 7 years, I want to say total, but that's usually from phase 1 to phase 3. So I think like if you're in phase 2 when you go to open label, that time might be like shorter than that. But usually as long as trials are going successfully and progressing towards potential approval, they will try to keep those open label. If they have an open label extension, they will try to keep it going, to the best of my understanding. And so inherently, because of the name open label, it literally means the label is open, so everyone knows what it is. So everyone that goes into open label is getting the study drug. And so if you were in the placebo arm, you still may never know that you were in the placebo arm when you cross over into open label, but there'll be this tapering process of coming off that and entering into the open label. And then in the open label, everyone has the study drug.
And then this last one was, are families able to request to participate in a trial if the primary neurologist or doctor does not agree with participation?
That's one where I actually don't know the answer. My inclination is to say yes. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, it's up to you. If your neurologist is opposed because of a significant safety concern, I would imagine that it might be a safety concern that would also be shared by the study doctors. But that's another one where I'm not positive. That's another one where I would need to go ask more, or again, I might uh pick Erin Frost's brain, since she's had a little more insight into running trials or being behind the scenes in trials. I don't know, Erin, if you'll have more insight to offer into any of these questions or not, but
Great. All right, if anyone else has questions, please drop them in the chat. Keep in mind, if we do run out of time, we will try to address all of those questions personally offline. But for now, I'd like to introduce you to each of our panelists who are going to share their personal experience on why they chose to participate in clinical trials, as well as any of the challenges they may have faced. So we're going to start off first with Erin Frost, who's not only a parent, but as Veronica just mentioned, is also a clinical trial coordinator. So Erin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so just kind of a history of our family. I'm married to my husband, Justin, and we have two girls, Mia and Hannah. Mia is 15 and Hannah's 14, and Mia has Dravet. So I'm going to try to condense 15 years of experience. But we live in North Carolina, and we moved here when Mia was 1, so been here most of her life and all of Hannah's life. Mia started having seizures at about 3 months old, and she wasn't formally diagnosed with SCN1A gene mutation until she was about 2.5. So we spent the first couple of years of playing with a lot of medications and a couple which, weren't good for Dravet, but didn't know what was going on. So we finally got a diagnosis. And as far as like treatments with Mia, I lost track, but I think we failed about 8 to 9 medications, and we retried a few of those. We had her on keto for 5 years, which was very good at the time for her. So we did that, and she also has a VNS. So as far as our experience with clinical trials, in the spring of 2015, she actually got into the Epidiolex trial, and that was really big for us. We kind of had backs against the wall, which a lot of us go through, where we've tried everything. What else are we going to do? And then we heard about this trial, and thankfully she qualified, which, a lot of studies like that one, they have their inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the, inclusion can be a lot for like a certain seizure count in like, say, a month. And we literally, we were having the worst year and a half leading up to this. And of course, things kind of settled out a little bit right before we were trying to get into this trial. So we're on pins and needles, actually hoping she would have that one more seizure to qualify, which sounds terrible, but you all know how that can be, very life-changing. So she got in, and she was in the trial for 3 years, and, went on to the open label until it was approved in, I don't remember what year that was, 2018, I think. So as far as me personally, going to all these visits, and I've worked in the medical field before having Mia, I just remember sitting in those visits and just talking with the coordinator and just thinking how do I do that job? That looks awesome, So many years later, I was able to transition into becoming a clinical research coordinator, and I started that in November of 21. So it's been a little over about a year and a half. So I'm still learning a lot, but I'm very appreciative of the, having the personal experience on being on the parent side and having my child in a study, so that, in my job now, and I work with peds, I'm able to relate a lot with them, which has been great. So as far as the trial itself, for us, the trial itself was a double blind placebo. So going in, we didn't know if she was going to be on drug or not. And she started doing really, really well after trying it. So I figured, hey, if that's placebo, we'll take that. But Anyway, so for us, it was a really good, positive experience. It was kind of up and down for a bit, but we had an amazing team, and it was very life-changing, to the point where some folks that have met my daughter more recently in the last couple of years would never believe the child that she was before being on this medication. So yeah, we're very blessed and grateful for these trials and research. So that's my story. Are you muted?
Sorry, I was
That's
trying to
okay.
unmute. Thank you for sharing your story, Erin. We really appreciate that. And I know there'll be a lot of questions, and it's inspiring that you ended up becoming a clinical trial coordinator as part of your experience. Next, I'm going to introduce Casey Capps. She is one of our parent ambassadors, and her son recently participated in his first trial. Casey.
Hi, everybody. My name is Casey. I have 3 kids. My middle child, Will, is 5, and he is my Dravet syndrome baby. Will's story, we live in Missouri, by the way. He had his first seizure at 3 months old. Like I'm sure all of you, we had no idea that anything was amiss until his first seizure happened. And he got his Dravet diagnosis pretty early compared to a lot of people that I know. We got our diagnosis the day he turned 6 months old. So we've known, he's 5 now. So we've had our diagnosis for quite a while. It was very, very hard. He hit the ground running with Dravet syndrome. We were intubated 10 times in the first year and a half. Just really, we tried every medicine that was out there at the time. And we were still having breakthrough seizures and intubated in the hospital. That first 2 years was just a blur. And when we got his diagnosis, the first thing my husband did was research a cure. Like I'm sure a lot of people probably got on the internet and did. And we came across a trial that had just started in mice. And we were like, this sounds so promising. It was a little sliver of hope to hold on to in an otherwise very dark 2 years. And we followed it, moved from Texas to Missouri in the process. And that brought us a lot closer to Chicago. That's a big hub for Dravet syndrome trials. So as soon as we moved home, we made an appointment with a Dravet specialist in Chicago. And that was kind of our in to be like, because we knew from the get-go that we wanted to be in a clinical trial. We felt like anything we could do to get toward a cure, anything that wasn't giving medicine every day, like anything, it didn't matter. It didn't matter what it was. So at that point, COVID happened shortly after that. So we got a little thrown off, but I harassed the trial coordinator. Erin probably has had some families do the same. Like I emailed this lady every couple months and was like, hey, what's going on with Will? And like, we know he's on the list, but what's going on? I haven't heard anything. And it took probably 2 years from when I first reached out to when I finally got the call and saw that it was a Chicago area code and picked up the phone. And as soon as she introduced her name, I just started crying because I knew instantly what it was. So we drove 5 hours up to Chicago and they ran a bunch of tests. Like Erin said, Will had to have a certain number of seizures and type of seizures to be accepted. And it is a weird time because you are kind of like, okay, let's have some seizures. Let's get this in the bag because it's just something that you want so much. And they let us know that he got in. And not gonna lie, there is a lot that I didn't even realize goes into a clinical trial. And this being our first one, I have learned so much. Like we have to keep a paper seizure log every single day of what type of seizures he's had, how many he's had, if they look better or worse than what his baseline is. he had an ear infection a few weeks ago, and I had to call the trial coordinator and tell her how long he was on this antibiotic for, what all of his symptoms were, if we had to do a bridge medicine. Like, they have to know every single thing going on with your child at all times. And it's a lot. I mean, we either take a train or drive 5 hours. The first part of the study, we are going every 4 weeks for a dose, and then going a week later to follow up, also in person. So they do, like Veronica was saying, we do get compensated by the company for that, but it is still, you know, I have 2 other kids, and it's a lot, but it is, I would do it again in a heartbeat. I was just telling one of my friends that to know that you have put your child into something that has made a difference, to maybe someday, like, even from my friends who have older kids, and seeing how much is already available to my child that wasn't available to theirs even 10 years ago, you know, to have a place in that history of working toward a cure, so that someday there's a Dravet baby out there that doesn't have to go their whole life with it. It's a very empowering feeling to know that you can take something that was so dark and depressing of a diagnosis 2 years ago and work towards something that's going to make the world a better place.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Casey. Next, I wanted to introduce Shannon Cloud, who's also a parent ambassador, and her daughter has participated in multiple trials.
Hi, I'm Shannon Cloud, and my daughter Elena is 17. She was diagnosed when she was 4.5 years old after 4 years of seizures. We live in Atlanta, and we've been really fortunate that our primary neurologist has participated in a lot of these studies. So it's been pretty much a no-brainer every time. I'm usually the one saying, "Hey, when's it starting? You can enroll us. We'll be your patient number one." Because it's local, so we haven't had the travel factor. And our thinking has always been, you know what, if it helps her, this is great. If she's not having terrific seizure control already, why wouldn't we try something new? Because it gets us earlier access to something that can help her. And if it doesn't help her, then we know we're helping everybody else in the future. And unfortunately for us, we've done 3 medication studies, and none of them has been her true miracle, but it is wonderful to see the other kids that are doing really, really well. I will say the most recent study, one thing that was easier is more of the appointments were virtual. And I don't know if that was just the way this was structured, or if it's just because we live in a post-COVID world now, and a lot of the study sites probably had to do that to reduce travel. So even here in Atlanta, I think we only had to go in person 4 times throughout the study. So that was a huge help, just being able to get on the phone and talk to the study coordinator myself without even having to have Elena with me. She could be at school and I could just be giving the report to the coordinator on how she was doing. So that was a huge help. We never found out in any of the 3 medications whether she was on the real thing or the placebo. As a parent, you know your child pretty well. And so you kind of are suspicious, and you kind of, if you see differences, you know that. We're pretty confident in this 3rd one that she was on, that she was probably on the real thing. But we don't know. And unfortunately, you typically never do get to find that out. But the good news is that if you decide to stay on and do the open label, then you know that you are getting the real thing. So for us, the first study we did, Epidiolex, it was either phase 1 or phase 2. It was very early on. And so we were actually, I think the reason she was selected for that one was because at the time she had pretty good seizure control. And they were just truly looking at dosing and safety. They weren't even really counting the seizures so much. And the unfortunate thing is it was just a quick 4-week study. And then because it was so early in the trial process, we had to wait 8 months before open label started. And that was very frustrating because, you know, we didn't know if it was helping or not. And it was CBD, and CBD was the thing. And, you know, so we were really, really eager to get started. And it was unfortunate that we had to wait so long. But typically, if it's a phase 3 trial, I think then you're more likely to be able to just roll right on over to open label. The last study that we were in, we actually did have to pull her out early. She was definitely having some adverse events. Whether or not it was med related, we don't really know, but obviously it had to be recorded as such. She was very tired and not eating. And then through doing labs, we actually found out that her Depakote level had gone sky high. And that's why we were seeing those things that we always see with Depakote. We really don't know if it was the study med or if it was just, you know, who knows, who knows what might've been causing it, but we did have to pull her out. And that's one reassuring thing about doing the study is that, sure, you're signing these documents that you're going to participate, but ultimately the health and safety of your child comes first. And so if you're not comfortable with how they're doing or seeing something you don't like, they can't force you to stay in it. So you do have the ability. At that point, it was pretty much an easy decision with our doctor, like, absolutely, we're taking her off. We need to get her Depakote level back in check. Yeah, I mean, we also did an observational study too, in addition to the medical one. And so I just always encourage people, especially our local people here in Atlanta. I'm like, you know, hey, it's available, give it a shot, try it. You never know if it can help. And if it doesn't help your child, then hopefully it will help somebody else.
Thank you, Shannon. Next, I wanted to introduce Tatiana Lopez. Tatiana is actually also DSF's DEI coordinator, but her daughter recently went through or is currently in her first trial, and she was going to share some of the challenges they faced.
Hi, yes, my name is Tatiana. I am newer with the DSF team, but not only am I with the foundation, but I do have a 3-year-old daughter, Eliana, who is living with Dravet. She had her first seizure at 2 months old. It was not the typical tonic seizure. So we were told many times that, you know, it wasn't truly seizure activity. It could be this, it could be that. So we were kind of like pushed around, and her symptoms were ignored for a good while before she ended up having her first 3-hour-long seizure that led to intubation. And it was kind of like the light bulbs went off unfortunately at that time, that maybe there is something here. We finally were able to get genetic testing, and along with a lot of other things, and we got her diagnosis right around 5.5, 6 months. Because of her age and size, we were very limited in the medications that were available to her. I think at that time there was one that they would approve her for because she was just a very small baby. And we went from there. We eventually did get older and gained enough weight to start trialing a few other medications. We've probably been through about 9 or 10 that were not giving us control. And we continue to see intubations. We continue to see a lot of our motor skills declining. And we then ended up doing a corpus callosotomy, which is where, you know, they attempt to separate both half of the brain so that the seizures aren't, for lack of better words, kind of feeding off each other energy-wise from one side to the other. We were sure that that was going to be it, but unfortunately that was not the saving grace for us. So at 1 year old, we had a corpus callosotomy. At 1.5 years, we were no longer eating at all by mouth, no talking, no speaking, no words, no movement. And the seizures were just hitting us hard. We knew of a trial that was coming up, and my doctor was very good at being extremely proactive. I didn't have to reach out to the clinical research team until it was, them saying, here's the paperwork to sign up. But 6 months prior to the trial, we had already submitted our paperwork. It was only a matter of her age. The trial began at age 2. So we began the countdown to her second birthday.
No. I think we lost Tatiana. Oh dear. Well, let's go ahead and we can move on to Erin Rioyo, who is our last panelist, and she is also the DSF Family Support Liaison, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her clinical trial experience as well.
Hello, I know we're running short on time and I want Tatiana to be able to finish if she's able to come back, but also save some time for questions. But as Marianne mentioned, I'm the Family Network Support Group Liaison. And so I sometimes I'm out there encouraging families to be participating in trials and learning this information. So you may recognize me from that, but I'm also, my husband Leo and I have 2 children. Eloise just turned 7 years old in January, and my son Leonel just turned 9 years old yesterday, and he is diagnosed with Dravet syndrome. And he actually has a little bit more atypical of a journey than most. He didn't have his first recognizable seizure until 14 months old. In retrospect, looking back, he had an event at 11 months old, but we tried one medication and he, Dravet, we believe, just was giving us 8 months of seizure freedom. We're not particularly sure that that medication was working so well, and it was just maybe not Dravet making our lives quite miserable yet. Fast forward to January of 2016, and he had 2 months worth of horrible seizures that led to a diagnosis by April. And I say, I give you that timeline because we did go through a very quick timeline to Dravet, and like many of the other panelists here, we instantly started looking into what treatment options there were, and we saw that it was such a treatment resistant disease that we said, okay, then what's next? We saw at the time there were trials for both Epidiolex as well as Fintepla, fenfluramine, and we talked to our neurologist right away to get in that trial. Or into one of the trials. We hadn't gone through failing a bunch of different medications. We had tried and stopped one, and we're still on another, and then added a third. And I know for many of you, you know, got almost into double digits before you were able to access something. Once we found out about the 2 trials, and I should also mention we live just outside of the Seattle area. So like Shannon mentioned, we have a comprehensive care center very close to us. So we almost felt as we were selfishly just thinking of our child, but as we went through, we thought about it really is a responsibility for our community to be able to have such easy access. We don't have to travel very far. The appointments were frequent and they took a lot of time, but we were still very close to home. We moved from, as Casey mentioned, harassing the clinical trial coordinator about when they were getting started. I think that had to have been sometime in the summer of 2016, and by December of 2016, we were in an open label. He was over the age of 2, which you'll hear Veronica mention many start at the age of 2, although many are exploring earlier options. And like Shannon mentioned, we've never found out if he was in the placebo or the open label, placebo or receiving the study drug. But by the time we received open label in around March of 2017, so about 3 months later, we were in the open label. We actually had a lot of adverse events in which we almost stopped the trial. His seizures actually greatly increased. They increased in frequency, they increased in severity. They increased in time, and we were giving a lot of rescue meds, and we nearly dropped out, but instead we worked with our trial team to adjust the dosage, as well as, and this is not necessarily a common thing, but we added a different drug that was already approved for Dravet syndrome. And with that, we were able to continue and find a balance. So it wasn't our miracle per se, like a lot of people have experienced, but we have stayed the course. We kept doing the trial, and for us, it was really being able to access something that was new and out there, that had a lot of great study behind it already. And so I really encourage families to look into that for that early access to treatment. And then you get to carry over, you know, if they get to the point of being FDA approved, you continue to have access to it immediately, rather than waiting like most families in our community do. I am mindful of the time. I see that it's 5 o'clock right now, so I want to turn it back to Mary Ann. But I appreciate everyone showing up here to learn more about clinical trials and participating.
Thanks, Erin. I know we're running a little over time here, but I think maybe if we can do another couple of minutes. Tatiana, I know we didn't get to hear all of your stories, so maybe I'll start with you. I think you've all done a great job and really kind of given a robust overview and very unique perspectives of why you participated or what your experiences look like. So you've covered most of the questions that came in prior to the webinar, but maybe if each of you could just take the time to answer, is there anything you wish you would have known before the trial? And let's start with Tatiana, since we ended up losing her there for a minute.
The one thing I wish I would have known, which I'm very thankful that the trials do that, is the amount of pre-testing, follow-up testing that goes along with each appointment. They do tell you ahead of time how many appointments, how long the trial research is. For us, though, there was a lot of pre-testing that needed to happen. And then, of course, when you have a child that is sensory sensitive, testing has to be broken up into days. So that was a bit overwhelming to process. So for one dosing, it could be about a 2-3 day, hospital preparation in order to get all of the testing done. So it is a bit difficult, to watch that process. But again, I understand why it's necessary. I am thankful that they monitor absolutely everything that's going on with blood, ultrasounds, echoes, all of those things. But it is a lot to process. I mean, you definitely have to commit to the time that it takes to truly engage in one of the clinical trials.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything else they wanted to add that surprised them or that was unexpected?
I'll just speak a little bit to those days that you're going to appointments, like Tatiana was mentioning, can be a lot, and it takes a lot of support. And so not being afraid to ask out to your community. Maybe on those days you make sure that you do not cook dinner on those nights and you have put a meal plan in place, or that you are just taking some time for yourself after those appointments, because it is a long day. Making sure that your partner and you are both on the same page about all that goes into the tracking, the seizure diary, making sure that both of you, if you do have a partner and you're working with the coordinator, making sure that you're both informed about all of the information there, and that it's not just left on a parent to take it on.
Thank you for that, Erin. I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up since we're a few minutes over. I just wanted to thank everyone again who was part of the panel. This is such an important topic for our community. It's really important for us to understand the process and participate if we want to see research and new treatments move forward. And so thank you for all of those who come before, and I hope you've inspired some of our families that have joined us today. And for those who are still have questions or considering participating in a trial at any time, please feel free to reach out to Veronica or anyone else on our team. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.